So what is mundanity? Even the word just sounds like an insult. If someone calls something mundane, you don't think, wow, that's so cool. You think, oh, it's probably going to be boring, repetitive, grey, and the kind of thing that you have to get through in order to get to the good part. But that's the strange thing, because if we're honest, most of our life is not the peak. It's not the cinematic moment or the confession or the big romantic date. But in actuality, most of life is this in-between. So if we keep treating the in-between as the part of our life that we're trying to escape, we're going to end up missing all of it. And that's what I'd like to talk about in this episode, the practice of being mundane. Not the practice of becoming boring or giving up everything extraordinary or pretending that folding the laundry is suddenly the most amazing act of the human experience. But I mean to practice coming to terms with the parts of our lives that are not extraordinary. The normal days and the flat parts, the routines and the version of ourselves that is kind of uninspiring. Because I think a lot of us have become very uncomfortable with ordinary life. Not because ordinary life is empty, but because we've been trained to believe that if something isn't exceptional, then it's probably lacking. We live in a time where almost everything can be made into something. A walk becomes content, a shower becomes a ritual, a Sunday cleaning day becomes a reset. And I use this language too. Actually, I think it's quite fun that we can make these really boring things into something a little bit more fun. And I love these little aesthetic details that we add in to make our life a little bit softer. Because it's true, a coffee can really make me feel like a cool girl walking down the street sometimes. But also, I think there's a point where normal life has started to become branded before it can even be enjoyed. Like if the ordinary isn't turned into something productive, useful, or visually attractive, then it doesn't really count as anything. And I don't know if that pressure is always obvious. Sometimes it's really subtle. It's the feeling that you should be doing more, saying more, showing more, contributing more in a conversation. It's kind of like the slight embarrassment of when someone asks you what you did in a day and the honest answer is that you did nothing, that we feel like we have to dress it up and say, oh, I had a life admin day, or oh, I was just taking it really slow, and those things might be true, but I wonder why nothing much feels so weak of a response, and why a day needs defending just because it wasn't impressive. I think that's where the problem starts. We have begun to confuse ordinary with inadequate. A normal day can feel like evidence that our life isn't moving fast enough. A quiet season in our life can feel like stagnation. And having a set, peaceful routine can somehow feel like we lack ambition in our lives. And maybe that's because we're constantly exposed to everyone's peaks and their troughs, since even those on social media that are relatable choose to show even their worst moments where they're so incredibly sad or filled with anxiety and fear to make them more human, essentially. But in fact, all it gives us is another tool to compare ourselves with, because otherwise at least we would know that social media isn't real. It's not what everyone makes it out to be. You see, there was this thing that I read in a book recently, and the author basically was talking about how we're in an age where everyone is becoming more real and relatable, and yet because even that is so curated, even now our idea of realness and what a normal day should feel like, especially with the rise of day in the life content, is so different to what real life actually looks like, because it's not performative or extraordinary all the time. A lot of the time it's just doing the simple acts that we do every day, which is cooking and eating and doing our laundry and cleaning. So now we don't just compare our normal lives to other people's lives, but we essentially compare our ordinary moments to their exceptional ones. For example, our Tuesday afternoon is being compared to someone's launch day for their company. But what we haven't seen is the fact that they've been building it and working to the ground for months before that's even come to fruition. We compare ourselves with someone's trip to Bali while simultaneously watching someone else hit a relationship milestone and seeing someone's glowing morning routine that makes it look like they have it all together. And then we wonder why our own life feels slightly underwhelming. Because of course it does. If you're constantly being shown proof that everyone else is confident, super duper inspired or driven or even hyper productive, then a normal day can start to feel like a failure. Not because the day is bad, but just because it doesn't perform well. It doesn't necessarily necessarily explain itself, and it doesn't give us much to say, or it makes you feel like you're not the main character in your own life. I think there's also an element of fear in this. If we're not cool enough or inspiring enough or thoughtful enough, then people won't want to know us. Like, if I'm not in an exciting phase, or I'm not creating something, or if I'm not presenting a version of myself that feels essentially worth keeping up with, then why would people want to get to know me at all? And what are people actually getting to know? And I don't mean that in a self-pitying way, not at all. I don't think this is about having low standards or a terrible confidence. It's just food for thought, because I don't think that I'm the only person that has felt that element of pressure. You know, especially when it comes to relationships or dating, or the idea of someone getting to see you. As we grow up, the checklist definitely increases. And honestly, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I feel I have reasonable, almost great standards, because having standards is so important. You should know what you want, what you feel aligned to, and what you know will bring value, what you are looking for when finding someone that you'd like to build a life with. But I do wonder about how much of that checklist is necessary, and how much is internalized from a culture that makes everyone seem like they have to be this exceptional person to be chosen. Because it's no longer just, are you loyal? Are you kind? Are you emotionally available? Are you funny? It's now a question of, are you ambitious enough? Have you healed enough? Are you independent enough? Or successful enough? And the list just goes on and on and on. And then there's so many parallels that you can't be boring, you have to be busy. You shouldn't be dependent, rather you should be driven and not consumed by work. And obviously, some of these things really do matter, especially in finding someone that is compatible with you. But it sometimes can feel like people are being expected to be this fully formed version of a brand, essentially, of like the perfect person that I'm looking for. Because that's where mundanity becomes so vulnerable. Because to be known properly is to be seen not in your most impressive state of when you're on a stage receiving an award. It's about being seen in, you know, the slightly tired version of yourself, and the person that has had a long ass day, the version that is quiet for no reason, and the version that gets dramatic over little things. Because let's be real, if we were with this person that is constantly perfect, I think it'd be a little bit exhausting. Additionally, I feel like we're so quick to judge sometimes, because even just taking a little moment to understand if a person in their most normal state is worth knowing, we have to have trust. And you know, maybe intimacy is mundane in so many ways. Not boring at all, but just ordinary. I mean, it really lives in repetition. I mean, just to take my parents for an example, where I see them after 20 years of marriage, and their love lives on through these small, ordinary moments of checking in with each other, of seeing the look on their face when they enter a room, knowing how they like their chai, understanding what will recharge them after a long day and what makes them feel calm. Because grand moments matter, sure they do. To me, it's kind of that grand moments allow you to see someone's creativity. But I think you can find out if a relationship with anyone is real in the ordinary. I mean, you must see it in friendships all the time, where if you have a time in which you're not speaking or doing something fun, how quickly does your conversation just completely die out, and then you're left a little bit awkward, rather than just enjoying each other's company. Because it's not in these extraordinary moments if you find out whether someone really impresses you, but it's in whether the normal version of them feels like somewhere you can stay without wandering off. And maybe that's true with ourselves too, because if I'm only okay with people knowing me when I only feel worthy to be known, of like when I feel as though I'm being inspiring, then what am I actually letting people know in general? I'm not really letting myself be known. In fact, I'm letting people meet the version of me that I've curated and that I've made the easiest to admire. And that becomes exhausting, because then the self becomes something you have to maintain. You're not just living, you're essentially micromanaging an impression of a life. You're not just being yourself, you're constantly making sure that there's something worth being seen, whether it be from the conversation and what you say to the way you look and the way you dress. And that's why I don't think the practice of being mundane is very small. It's actually really confronting, because it removes the performance. It asks who you are when there's no storyline, and who you are when the day doesn't make you look interesting. And you know, it's quite fun, because literature has been asking this question for such a long time, even if not in those exact words. So one of the reasons I think Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway is so important even today is because it takes place in the span of a single day, with a woman doing something as ordinary as planning a party. And this is the entire story. So on the surface, it's not an epic plot, it's not life-changing necessarily, but it shows how enormous the inner life is. It talks through these concepts of memory, regret, love, grief, aging, and all of it lives inside this one moment. And it proves to be that life doesn't have to be this dramatic, extraordinary thing on the outside, that someone's inner world is just as emotionally vast, if not tons more so, because the brain and your imagination is quite frankly limitless. It's amazing because if we just stop to think in these small moments, we can create such magical beauty out of them, even if it's not seemingly so, and you might feel a bit crazy for making washing the dishes a whole soap opera, but you can, is my point. In George Eliot's Middlemarch, there's also a very similar thing that he touches upon. It's not this book about one hero having this really extraordinary life, but it's about ordinary moral choices. It's about disappointment. It's about marriage and the ups and downs, and it's about illusions and kindness. In that story, it shows how a character is not formed through these big life-changing decisions, but it's in the small ones. So if you haven't taken a look at that, I really recommend you do. And I love that because I think it really does challenge how we give exceptional moments all of this grandeur when it doesn't mean that those are the only meaningful moments. Because I think it's a lot more meaningful when someone's able to let down their guards and the faces that they wear and are able to be honest and vulnerable with the people around them and even with themselves. There's one more myth that I actually quite like that I thought was quite relevant for this episode because it's the myth of Sisyphus. If I remember correctly, it basically talks about this man that was condemned to roll a boulder up and down a hill for the entirety of his life, again and again and again, like literally forever. It's such an extreme version of a repetitive task. And I'm not saying that our daily routines are that tragic, although laundry can sometimes feel like that. We are constantly doing things that don't stay finished. We clean, things get messy. We eat, we get hungry again, and the list goes on and on and on. We build, we maintain, and we repeat. But Albert Camus's interpretation of this myth was that it wasn't just a punishment, but it was kind of a show of how someone that knows that they are condemned to this for the rest of their life, yet they have found a way to live in this absurdity of a life. And I think in some way or the other, we kind of are doing the same thing. He knew what his life was going to consist of, similarly to how we know there are things that we are going to constantly have to do for the rest of our lives. And we might not be rolling a boulder up a hill, but we definitely do have repetition. The question is whether we treat repetition as a proof that life is meaningless, or whether we find a way to live inside of it without needing every act to lead to some grand outcome. You know, it's quite cool because so many spiritual traditions relate back to this. I mean, we look at Zen traditions, for example. There is so much emphasis on ordinary actions: sweeping, washing the bowls, drinking tea, walking, breathing. And it's not because the task itself is glamorous, but in fact, it's because having deep attention transforms the task into something else entirely. In Jain and yogic traditions too, there's a deep reverence and importance on awareness and intention, because the philosophies are focusing on the inner state behind the physical action. It's not necessarily what you do, but it's the consciousness that you bring to it. And I think that gives mundanity a different weight, a different meaning entirely, because especially in my own journey of faith, where I think that I have to set out a certain time to be spiritual, where I have to carve out time essentially, but rather living in the mundane and practicing mundanity means that ordinary life isn't separate from a spiritual one. It's actually where spirituality has to happen, just by having presence in our daily life, in all the actions that we do. For example, a shower, we can automatically increase our compassion and use less water just by staying present. Whereas if we were doing something else and, you know, rearranging conversations in our mind while showering, our attention is elsewhere. And so this mindfulness that we could have had during the act is just lost. And it's that lack of awareness that shows us that we may forget things, or we just may not think enough or be present enough to even know that we care about them in the first place. Because it's quite easy to feel spiritual in a beautiful setting or a retreat or in the time in the morning where you've dedicated to just spirituality. But it's much more difficult to stay spiritual in the moments that you're tired, you're angry and irritated, and when food isn't ready. And that's where the practice is way more honest and you get to learn so much more about your mental state. Can I remain aware when nothing is designed to make me feel aware? Can I be kind when no one is praising me for having a level of consideration? And can I be present when the moment is really not beautiful? And this is where the topic of autopilot comes in. We go through something like 30 to 35,000 semi-conscious micro decisions a day. And a lot of them are automated because our brain has already thought them through and it's trying to take some of the pressure off. It's essentially trying to protect us from exhaustion. And I'm so grateful for that because I don't want to consciously relearn how to open the door every time I do it. Autopilot is so useful. However, the problem is when autopilot becomes the only mode, when we get so good at moving through the day that we stop actually being inside of it. When we arrive somewhere and we barely remember the journey, or eat something and we don't remember tasting it. Instead of being present, we actually just end up disappearing completely. And technology makes this even more complicated. James Clear in his book Atomic Habits talks about habit stacking, which I think is great because obviously it's much easier to tie a new habit that you want to form to one that is already pre-existing because it helps your neural pathways connect. For example, it's like after I make coffee, I pack my lunch automatically. It kind of clicks in because we need life to be easier sometimes and we need the pressure to be taken off. But we've now taken ease so far that almost every point of friction can be removed. You can automate reminders, routines, shopping lists. The list goes on. Even tiny little household things with a little NFC chip. As something as small as reordering a bag of dog food, what I saw online, and tapping your phone with the NFC chip and it automatically adds it to your Amazon cart and buys it for you. Like, what? I'm not against it. I think it's useful. It's so clever. It's really cool that we've gotten that far. But I keep thinking and I keep wondering, at what point does removing friction remove contact? Because friction is annoying, sure, but it's also where attention lands. It's where you notice what needs doing and where you essentially touch your own life. Because if everything is automated or outsourced or sped up or optimized, then when are you actually making time to practice being in your life and making these small decisions? Pandora Sykes, in a book that is one of my favorite books that I've read this year called How Do We Know We're Doing It Right, has this essay called Relentless Pleasure. I would really recommend people take a read. And in this essay, she talks about a term called infobesity, where it basically means that we are constantly being clogged by overinformation. Our arteries are being clogged like cholesterol with information. We are constantly consuming, not even in big intentional ways. A reel here, a podcast there, a news article headline, a comparison we didn't ask for, but we took it in anyway. And we are so mentally full, but it doesn't feel nourishing. And the mundane is where we notice that the most because it's the easiest gap to fill. When we're waiting, we end up scrolling. If we're walking, we end up calling someone. Eating becomes watching and cleaning becomes listening to something. And don't get me wrong, I adore cleaning with the music on because it makes me feel like I'm in a movie. But I think there's a strong difference in adding something because it brings joy to our lives and adding something because we're uncomfortable with the gap and the space that it's created. And that difference really matters because one will feel nourishing and one is kind of numbing, it's kind of draining. One brings you closer to a moment and makes you embrace it and enjoy it so much more, and the other one gives you the escape route out. And I think we can usually feel which one's which, like quite easily. We know when we're listening to something because it opens it up and we're listening to something because we're avoiding something. We know when we're scrolling for fun and we're scrolling because we're looking for something to busy ourselves with. This is where I think we confuse peace with boredom. If your nervous system is constantly expecting stimulation, then peace can start to feel empty at first. Stillness can feel like nothing is happening at all. And when there's a little bit of quiet, instead of feeling peaceful, it can essentially feel a bit suspicious of like, oh, I'm not doing anything right now. And a normal day can feel like a lack when actually your body is just finally not being pulled in 7 different directions. And I find that so interesting because the one thing we always say we want is peace. And yet when it arrives, we somehow feel uncomfortable. And yoga and pranayama for me personally have taught me this in a very direct way. Breath is the most ordinary thing in the world. We do it unconsciously all the time, every day. But when you sit with it and you're doing nothing but breathing, you realize how difficult it is to stay in one place, at least mentally. Your mind will wander, it will judge, it will get bored, it will make up scenarios, and it will ask when this is going to end. And then you return, not necessarily becoming perfectly still, but noticing it, noticing that you left your focus and you're able to return back. And maybe mundane life is similar. Maybe those are the pauses and the moments that bring us back to ourselves. And this is why I don't really want the answer, if there is an answer, to be romanticize your life harder. I love romanticizing life. Even that can become another form of pleasure. You start feeling like every coffee needs to be beautiful and every morning needs to be soft, but that has a level of pressure attached to it because every evening that I don't have plans somehow now needs to be restorative. And then even presents, when you wanted to, enjoy your life, becomes a pressure, becomes a performance even. Taking your time can become another standard that we're now failing at. Sometimes I want to just chop the damn pepper and not turn it into a life lesson or a metaphor. And I think that's the solution, if there is one, maybe not to force meaning onto every mundane moment, but to stop assuming that ordinary means meaningless, not to make every task sacred, but to allow the normal parts of life to count, not necessarily to reject ambition and to not be pushing and striving every moment. I love striving. I believe in it more than anything. I love growth. And if we don't move and if we don't want to expand, then we will stagnate. And then we wouldn't have created, invented, or challenged ourselves. And there's something so great about wanting more. But I think the question is, one, more of what and in what direction? Because so often more means outward, more success, more recognition, more proof that we're doing life correctly. But maybe sometimes, if not always, it needs to mean more inwards, more honesty, more steadiness, more trust that our life doesn't need to look insane and cool, more capacity to just be in our ordinary state and not in this made up one. And maybe that's what all of this literature and mythology and the life we experience has been telling us all this time. Virginia Woolf shows us that an entire day can encompass a whole universe worth of emotions. George Eliot shows us that a character is shaped through small choices rather than the big, huge decisions. Sisyphus shows us that repetition is part of the normal human condition. It's what we do. And spiritual practice shows us that awareness is not reserved for dramatic moments. Our lives show us again and again that the ordinary is not an interruption to meaning. It's where meaning has to be practiced. The result of practicing mundanity is not that life becomes less exciting. I don't want a flat life. I don't want to stop wanting beautiful, amazing things, but I do want to stop treating the ordinary as something that I have to get through. I want to be less afraid of a normal day, less dependent on something being seen as exciting, more able to be with parts of my life that don't have a storyline. Because maybe a full life is not necessarily a loud life. And a meaningful life is definitely always not going to be visibly meaningful. Maybe a person worth knowing is not a person performing at their coolest self. Some days are just the ground, and we need the ground, otherwise we'll have nothing to climb from. So maybe the practice of being is this: learning not to abandon the ordinary in the pursuit of the extraordinary, letting a normal day just be normal, and letting yourself be a person instead of a project, just for a little while. This week, maybe just try it once. Not as a challenge or a self-improvement tactic, not as another thing to do correctly, but just choose one ordinary moment, and instead of escaping it or trying to fill it with something, just be in it. Make your coffee, walk somewhere, cook something, sit in silence for a few minutes, and notice whether you feel bored or whether you reach for stimulation. Notice whether you start trying to turn a moment into a lesson, which I do all the time. And then if you can, just let it be ordinary, because maybe mundanity isn't the opposite of meaning. Maybe it's just where meaning has been hiding in plain sight. So that's my thoughts on this topic today, and I hope that you took something from this. As always, please do like, share, follow, and stay tuned for the rest of the episodes. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the day. Lots of love.